Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Actually didn't fly from New York. I've been in Berlin for like 2 weeks, so I'm a little tired. So sorry about that. Um, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about open source, and I guess I was like, I'm trying to figure out, is it a charity, is it a business? I didn't know how interesting that was, so I guess I'm changing the title. Um, I guess it can be a charity and a business. I think it's just a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's kind of complicated just talking about money in general, at a personal level, let alone in open source. So I'd say I don't really have any advice in this talk. It's just kind of talking about what I've learned in the last year. There's definitely a lot of survivorship bias in that I'm still doing open source full time, and I've made it in some people's minds. I have a certain view of open source based on the project that I work on, but hopefully some of this stuff resonates with people. So yeah, I work on a project called Babel. I'm one of the maintainers. We have around 6 core maintainers. I'm the only one that's working on it full-time, getting paid by the community through crowdfunding to work on it. Everyone else is a volunteer. And so, yeah, I just want to talk about open source and leave you with some questions, like what is open source, and maybe is there a certain definition of what open source should be? And maybe that the fact that it's so hard for us to talk about it is because it's so malleable and it reflects more of like what we want it to become, what we desire out of it. And so I guess the question is like, what are we reflecting when we do open source? And the way I want to learn what open source is about is by living it out. Not as a objective, detached observer of open source as a phenomenon, but like someone that's in the thick of it and living it, trying to figure out what open source has to show us as a community. So yeah, it's been a whole year since I left my job. I used to work at Adobe. And I just took the leap of faith to kind of just quit and try to do open source full time. And somehow it's been like a year and like 3 months already. And it let me be in a position to be able to think about open source without the mental load of worrying about other things at work. And so yeah, I'm going to be talking about open source and money and some related topics. Yeah, so one of the first things you can do to earn money through open source is through ads. This kind of works well for projects that have a lot of views that people go to documentation a lot for. So if it's like Bootstrap or a UI toolkit, it might be a really commonly used library like Lodash, or if you're an application like Code Sandbox. It doesn't really work well for Babel as much. Even though it does get a lot of views, it's still something like everyone sets up one time, and then you complain about it when it doesn't work, and then you look at the docs. But it's not something everyone's always looking at. Another thing you can do is create content. And so you can do videos or workshops. You can do YouTube, and you can also live stream. But those are all things that you have to learn as well, like new skills that you have to do, and it takes a long time to build like a following and a desire to continue doing that. And yet, you can look at other parts of content creators and how like YouTubers are burning out, there are Twitch streamers where they all have 0 views. What should we do about that? And so the way that I've been able to fund myself and our team is through Open Collective, mainly through crowdfunding. And so that's like the most thing I'm familiar with personally. And getting companies to sponsor your project does take a lot of work. And it's true that our project is really big, so it is easier in a sense to be able to convince someone that like, hey, you actually use Babel. Actually, how many people have used Babel here? Okay, a lot. And so if you are a smaller project, it'd be a lot harder they may not even know what the name of your project is. Although it's true now that a lot of people don't know what Babel is because it's used in other things like Parcel and Next.js. And so, it takes a lot of work to get companies to sponsor you, and it's kind of even hard to measure if you're even doing anything right. I know the first month that I quit, I just talk to a bunch of companies, and then like once I had a conference to go to, I just stayed the week in San Francisco, and then I'd had like 4 meetings a day just to talk to different people about how we can work together. And it was surprising how easy it is to fill up your schedule because there's so many companies in San Francisco. And then also realizing how tiring it is to talk to people, because I was having a lot of fun because it's like people that you might know, but I think I always thought like the hard thing is writing the code, and that's like the real work. And it's really easy to measure. Like I wrote this many lines of code, but then it's like how many people did you talk to? How do you know that correlates to how much they can give you? And maybe it's when you're doing this kind of sales work, it's more of like just building a relationship. Maybe nothing will happen out of it. Maybe it'll take 2 years for something to happen. So sometimes you just get lucky. So Handshake, they raised a bunch of money, and then they gave 30 projects $100,000, and I don't know why, but our project happened to be one of them. So that can help you. And then you can also do Patreon, which is like mainly for individuals. So if you look at the graph, in the beginning I had 3,000 a month because 2 friends were like really nice, and they gave $1,000 for the first month to kind of like boost it up. But then you can see for the rest of the year it's been the same. And then for some reason recently a bunch of companies gave a little bit more. But yeah, it's kind of hard to sustain yourself, especially in the beginning, just if you decide to quit. So I would not recommend people decide to do that. And related to that, a lot of people might think, hey, if I just make a Patreon, I'm going to start earning money, or if I make a open collective, if you make it, it's obviously going to start at 0, and no one's going to know about it. And maybe you think, maybe I'll just copy someone else's description and their tier list and add some photos, or I'll copy their repo. And I think it kind of, when you're doing that, you're reducing like what is actually necessary to make it work. You can't, there's no formula to just look at how they did it and then just apply it to what you're doing. Yeah, you can see this. There was an article that got written in December 2017. No one makes a living on Patreon. So only 2% of creators, this was 2 years ago, earn more than minimum wage in the US. And so if you're making like more than 1,000, then you're doing well. But like I think most people aren't making even that. And so GitHub, they just announced GitHub sponsors, which I got to be a part of in the initial launch. I think there's a lot of takes around what's going to happen here, but at the very least, it's a place where Patreon was like kind of a third-party thing where you have to like link to it in your README, and now it's like right there next to the star and the fork, so people will know about this. And at least it'll give more visibility into the fact that some maintainers are looking for funding, and hopefully that will lead to not just individuals but corporate sponsors. Some thoughts about tips and donations. Yeah, so more context on this. I spoke at a conference called React Rally, and I just gave my talk, and then I didn't eat lunch yet, so I was just there, and then my friend just took a box and then just wrote tips for Babel in chalk. And then the next speaker's talk was over, and then the doors opened and people started putting money in there. And I think I got like $200. So that's like kind of cool, but also kind of sad that that's kind of like the state of how you can make money in open source. And I say this because, in a way, people might intuitively think about this. When you're accepting donations from people, it feels like it might lower your worth. It's like when you tip someone at a restaurant, like not as much as they could. Like if open source maintainers actually did like consulting or something, maybe they'll charge hundreds of dollars per hour, but then you're giving them like $1 or $5, thank you. And so even if you weren't intending it, or the maintainer weren't intending that to lower their worth, sometimes it might lead to a sense of like, people are already entitled when they ask you for help on GitHub, right? They're like, why didn't you fix this bug? Or you should have fixed this yesterday. And then, well, now it's like, I paid you $1, you definitely have to fix it. And so, but I don't think it's necessarily all bad. It's more of like a cultural thing. And so, I look at like streaming. So on Twitch, they have sponsorships from big companies, and they make money from that. But they also take donations and tips as well. And there's less of an expectation for them to do something. And maybe it's because it's real time, and they're like, hey, this person donated $5, and they get to see their name, and they feel something satisfactory about that. Yeah, I wanted to talk about notifications. So notifications, we already learned about how social media is bad in certain ways, and so getting a notification about how much money you're making is not that much better. It's really cool when someone gives you money, but then what happens when they stop doing it? What happens when like you just keep getting notifications like people deleted, and you're wondering, you start wondering about yourself. Did I not tell them enough about what I'm doing? Did I not do a good job? And all these what ifs. And so it's kind of best to not look at these kind of things just like any other social validation. And so, when I go to conferences like this and in person, the external validation does help, because people come up to you and they say, thank you for doing this, which is different from doing it online, because online nobody ever says positive stuff, it's always negative. It makes sense, because when it works, you don't have to say anything. And this is why I feel like we need like maintainer support groups, which I named it Maintainers Anonymous, like Alcoholics Anonymous, because you don't know who to talk to about these things. And if you talk about online, then you don't want to make people feel depressed that like you want everyone to do open source, but then the reality is that like it sucks a lot of the time. You don't want to promote that. And so you're struggling with it, and it's like, okay, maybe you need to like talk to each other about it, because you realize that other people are struggling with the same thing. Relating to crowdfunding, the Kickstarter, Patreon, all these things, they have this concept of tiers, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but usually it's something like, if you give me this, I'll also give you this other perk. Like I'll review your code, or I'll shout out your project on Twitter or something like that. And basically what you're doing there is just giving them a money amount for some kind of work when you're already doing all this work anyway. So it's like, I didn't want to sign up for donations knowing that I have to do even more work just to get another few dollars from someone. So what I decided to do for my Patreon is just think of things that I like. And so for like the $7 a month, I like board games. And there's a board game called Seven Wonders. So I just decided to just put 7 and just arbitrarily pick a number there. And hey, maybe I'll play board games with you. There is no dollar amount to that, because maybe they don't live where I live in New York, and you have to visit and stuff like that. Same with ping pong. So it's $11 because you play to 11 points. And I like Korean barbecue, or I like playing Mario Kart. And so I think what I tried to do here was just try to make it more personal. There's no like expectation necessarily that this is going to happen, but I would like to do it because all these things are ways that we can actually build a relationship where like we're interacting, versus just like, hey, here's a free sticker or something like that. So yeah, what I'm getting to is that perks become some kind of transaction. And so, is it really that hard to believe that someone might give you money without expecting anything in return? And, if we're able to see sponsors as, having a relationship with us, I don't want to have to bribe them to continue to give them money. If they don't want to give money, then they don't have to. And it changes the relationship on both sides. I might resent giving more whatever to people, and then they might only stick around because I'm giving them something. And this goes into other things like newsletters. Usually when you have one of these things, you might update them every month on what's going on. I don't want to update them with this robotic bullet list of what I've done, because they could have found that through a different avenue. But maybe something more personal that is more like, hey, we're just talking as friends on what I'm thinking. And I think that makes people want to support you more than just like the minimum amount. And why do we support anyone in the first place? I think there's some weird reason that we can't explain for why we're friends with people, and I think it's important that if we don't want to turn this thing into a giant transactional thing, then for me, I want to learn to be more of who I am and to figure out exactly like what makes yourself unique. Like I was able to do it this way because it just seems a lot more healthy on my end, and also people enjoy it when they actually get the chance to do any of those activities. Yeah, self-promotion is really hard, probably for a lot of people, including myself. Like you don't want to like tweet every week, "Hey, you can actually donate to me." Like that's really annoying to everyone, and it's really uncomfortable. This idea of like selling feels really wrong, maybe as programmers, and we don't understand that. Like, I think learning, like networking, isn't necessarily a bad thing, and coming to conferences, meeting people, making friends, genuinely getting to know who people are, is really awesome. And there's another sense where if you feel so bad about promoting yourself, everything you do is still marketing. Everything you do, especially online, is some kind of signal to show like how cool you are, or what your skills are, what your personality is, what your knowledge is. Regardless of intention, people will see it that way anyway. So if you're, and also if you're not doing it, no one else is going to either. Yeah, and one of the problems with I guess doing something in public or getting through crowdfunding is that you start thinking a lot more deeply about how you spend your time. Maybe you feel like you have to hustle and feel like you have to like earn the work, earn the money that people are giving you, versus when you have a salary. So in this situation, you almost feel like you owe people because you're getting money per month. You're like, okay, how do I make sure that I'm earning this? Versus like when you're at a company, you can take breaks during the day, you can rest, you can take vacations. I don't know what does it mean to take a vacation in open source? Normally, people don't really think about that. It's like a huge deal. You have to like make a whole blog post just to tell someone you like aren't going to be there for the weekend, which is like, yeah. And so another thing is that you always feel like someone is watching you, or like someone's micromanaging your work, when in reality, no one actually cares. And I think people just want to see you succeed in what you're doing. But I think it's just like a mental thing that it's really hard to get over, because that's like the culture of how open source is done. Yeah, similarly, how do you actually spend your money after you get it? I had to think about that a lot too. I think learning to spend money where I wouldn't have been before, just because I was stubborn or I mistrusted people, which is ironic because we trust people all the time in open source. Or it's just something unknown. Like, once you leave your job, you have to figure out how do you deal with health insurance, which you have no idea about, and then getting an accountant or a lawyer, setting up a company, all these things that you probably wouldn't want to have done when you got involved in doing open source. And yeah, I guess it's kind of embarrassing that it took me like a whole year just to set up an LLC company, even though I said I would do it like before I quit. It's not just hesitation. It's just like I don't even know what to do here. But then in another weird way, I realized like in some sense I feel a little bit more, or I feel more like wealthy than before. Even though I'm already well off, even though I make less money, I just felt like knowing where the money came from, it just helped me to, I guess, think more about like how do I appreciate that and how do I use it. Yeah, I also think about this too. So I have this friend Jeremiah. I met him like randomly when I was going to church with my friend, and he was just sitting there. And we brought him there, and I kept seeing him every day when I went to work. And so, like a lot of homeless people I see, you ignore them, sometimes you give them money, but it's pretty rare to actually like talk to them and then actually get to know them as people. I don't know, I just felt like I wanted to like sit with him, just talk with him and all that stuff. And I think about like, when you don't have that much, or when you have to report what you're spending on, especially on like Open Collective, you might feel like I can only spend money on what's essential. What happens about like leisure or play or just doing things that we spend money on? And I think about when you give money to homeless people, you might think, oh, they might spend it on something bad. Like they might get fast food instead of healthy food, or they do drugs or something. And it's like, well, we spend money on things that are inessential too. why should I feel so bad about giving more away? And I think it just gets into this question of like greed. It's like greed is a weird thing where it's hard to know exactly when. There's no like natural like edge or point where it happens. It's kind of just like slowly creeps up on you as you gain more money. You just feel like you need more. So I don't know. It's like, how do you stop yourself from feeling like you don't have enough? But yeah, maybe it's not just about money. Sometimes. So this is from a blog post we had for our 7.2 release. Babel implements proposals for TC39, which is the future of the language. And in a way, we're not limited just by money. A lot of it is just like there's too much work to be done. And so if companies can sponsor the work, then we would appreciate that. We don't have to be the only ones doing that work. And what I'm getting at here is that when we think about open source, you can think about it in terms of two things: the consumption of open source and the production of open source. And especially with the licenses, it's all around who is allowed to consume open source. And it seems like the point of open source is that anyone can use it for whatever reason they want. And the real problem is actually when it gets to the production side, which is how users affect people that work on open source. If we don't have to know who works on it or who uses it, but if they start asking making issues or asking for help, that's when it starts affecting maintainers' time, essentially. But if everyone just used it and then never asked a question, then in a sense we don't have extra work to do. We can continue moving on. I think as programmers, though, we have this default assumption and desire for making things more efficient, that we can just solve all of our problems through technology. But the question is like, is it always a good thing, and what are we doing it for? I really like this term, holy inefficiency. As we make everything more fast, do we want everything to be faster? Do we want our communications and relationships to be faster? Or do we actually want them to be inefficient? Because when we're around friends, we actually want to spend longer time with them, not shorter. We might even want to waste time with them because it's fun. So we should be thinking about what are the things in life that help us to kind of push back on this whole, moving as fast as possible, like being able to just be still, to rest, and to wait for things. And related to this is this idea that we have to try to measure everything because everything is quantifiable. And whether it's our success or our health or just something that's good, we always want to have put either a number value to it or a money value to it. DHH has this good talk that he did at RailsConf called Open Source Beyond the Market. Yeah, maybe we should think beyond the market. Maybe that if all we do in open source is raise money from VC and then try to pay it back, we're just playing the same game as proprietary software. And maybe open source should be pursued without this idea of the transaction. That even the idea of sustainability in itself implies that there is a scarcity problem, and in certain cases, maybe there isn't, and that we should maybe, like he suggested, you can do the KonMari method, just work on code just because it's fun, that it gives you joy. I don't know if anyone still remembers this reference, but someone put a picture of Guy Fieri in our source code, and we've been trying to. It's like we can kind of play with that, move forward with that. I made the location for the Twitter account is Flavortown, and even Dan recently he tried to combine that with the Game of Thrones reference. And talking about just every year, there's someone that not every year, all the time people are asking, how do you actually pronounce Babel? So one day I was like, okay, I guess we can actually just change the README. We asked someone who made their first PR to open source to add this. So the creator had a SoundCloud, and then we also just put it right there. We're also probably the only project that has their own official song. So you can check that out at song.md. And even on Twitch, I think, even though normally you go on Twitch to watch, video games and people playing with hundreds of thousands of viewers, there are also people that they broadcast to, let's see, only 20 people, and they read a book, or they're knitting, or they're painting. Maybe not every open source project needs to be a full-time job, or you need to get 1,000,000 stars. And there are plenty of people that don't want to do it full-time. So how do we support all the people along that spectrum? Is it even a good idea to make sure everyone is paid? Yeah, so when you think about open source, you usually think about freedom, and it talks about the freedoms that users have. But I also wonder about the freedoms of maintainers. Are maintainers actually free to leave projects, to take breaks, to not have to read every notification and answer every issue? In a sense, it's true, but why is it so hard for it to happen? I think it's because as maintainers, we still think it's the code that matters. And I can say that to you, I can say it to myself, I can talk about it in this talk, but I still act like all this anxiety comes over me when I don't actually believe that. I tried writing about this in an article I did recently, and it's like, I think we never feel like we're doing enough because there's an infinite amount of work to be done, and there's this almost like God complex where you feel like you're the only one that can do it, and that no one else can help. I think the thing about this is that all the guilt that you feel is basically mostly imposed on yourself, because we don't owe anyone anything. Right? As a maintainer, you are free to leave. Most people are volunteer. It's just that we haven't learned to set boundaries and say no. And so it's still our choice in the end to leave or not. But I think we can talk about freedom in terms of two ways: freedom from being able to not do something, but also freedom to do something. So negative freedom and positive freedom. And I think we can do more to figure out how not to just get people to transition out, but to cooperate and coordinate. And so the question that I'm trying to ask is what is asked of us? What's our responsibility to other maintainers and all of us as people? And I like what Paul says in Corinthians. He says, though I'm free from all, I made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. And what he's saying here is that even though he's free from all people, that he's not a servant to anyone. He's choosing to be a servant to people. And so he uses his freedom to serve and to help others. And I think that's a great way to think about it. And this is why I resonate with Polanyi's concept of indwelling. I talked about earlier about living out what you believe. And I think that's a good word to explain that our bodies and our participation in learning is really important to actually knowing anything. And when we indwell in what we study, it becomes an extension of ourselves, and we discover more about the world. An example of this, he uses the example of learning how to ride a bike. You're not just physically able to go to more places because you have a bike, but mentally you can imagine where you can go, and it opens up possibilities of what could be. And so this joy of discovering more is key, I think, to understanding how we can better understand open source as we commit to learning more about open source. And so in that sense, as I learn open source, I might see open source in other areas or other aspects of life, and particularly in faith community. So I made this podcast in October last year, and it's 10 episodes or 11 episodes now of me and my friend Nadia talking about how open source relates to faith, which seems like a totally unrelated topic. But I think this idea of serving people, of commitment, of trust, evangelism, fundraising, there's a lot of parallels that we might not see. An example of this, going back to this efficiency thing, I was thinking about how to teach some people at church how to code, and I was wondering what would be a course or an example. So I made this little, we have this elevator where you have to go down and get people, and so I just automated that. And I thought it was cool because then someone doesn't have to go down to pick them up. And it takes 30 seconds to get someone and come back up, and when you come back up, someone might call the phone again, you have to go down again. And so I thought it'd be it would save time. But then I realized later after I implemented this thing that, before, the person that had to go down to get that person, they're like greeting them. They get to say hi. Maybe if they're new, then they get to introduce themselves. And if we remove that if we remove the person from the equation, it's just they can just go up by themselves, and there is no one greeting. So we kind of lost the sense of the personal relationship. And so I'm just saying that like sometimes we kind of just want to do something really fast, and then we forget that we lost the human side of it. And another way I'm trying to do this is through another podcast. I don't know why I'm so into podcasts now, of talking about how open source relates to other aspects of life. Maybe you're a gardener, or you're a librarian, or you're a parent. We're all maintainers in different ways, and I think we can learn a lot from different disciplines. And so, yeah, I think my main point here is just that, we're going to learn more when we can improve our imagination of what open source can be. All right, thanks.